So with Daredevil Season 2 coming out this week, what I wanted to do here is spend the next several days running over the mini-series titled Marvel Universe vs. The Punisher. And what I'm hoping is that at the end of all this, you'll have had a pretty good time, but also have a better understanding of how Frank Castle deals with being one of the last surviving humans on Earth, as well as how this story differentiates itself from the one-shot comic, Punisher Kills the Marvel Universe. So the Marvel Universe vs. the Punisher was a 4-part series written in 2010 by Jonathan Maberry and was designed to isolate and highlight the one-man army concept of Frank Castle as it had been established by writer Garth Ennis. What I mean here is that for those of you who have not seen my video on the Punisher Explained, which you'll find in the description, prior to Ennis's run on Marvel Knight's Punisher in 2000 and 2001, as well as the start of Punisher Max Volume 1 in January of 2004, most of Frank Castle's stories in the late 1980s leading up to the mid-1990s were largely considered one-shots contained within a single volume. While this allowed writers the freedom to depict Frank Castle in different ways ranging from team-ups with and against major heroes, as well as focus on efforts in subduing criminals, the problem with this method of storytelling was that it took away from creating an immersive environment where the reader could literally track the actions of Frank Castle over time. While Ennis had been slowly building towards this idea with Marvel Knights, which served as a way for Marvel to outsource their publications amidst the near collapse of the comic industry, in 2004, when Garth Ennis launched Punisher Max, because the Max line of comics was designed to be adult-oriented, the violence, nudity, and language contained within allowed Ennis to literally provide fans with the Punisher series they'd been waiting for. This combined with the fact that Garth Ennis' first Max run spanned 75 issues and was composed of 13 story arcs, all of which maintained a singular continuity, the cohesiveness of the Punisher series came together to form this wholly celebrated story that elevated Frank Castle from an anti-hero restrained by decency to an absolute wrecking machine cutting a swath through the criminal underworld in a hail of bullets and blood. Now, while Maberry was restricted a bit in that the Marvel Universe vs. the Punisher was not part of the Marvel Max line and did not allow him to depict acts of gratuitous violence and carnage, the story still maintained elements of Punisher Max in terms of the darker nature and the melancholy tone of the story, dealing with the collapse of society. Having said that, as we get into this, one of the best elements of Maberry's writing came in the form of Frank Castle's monologue by way of the War Journal. To sidetrack here, the concept of the War Journal dates back to 1988 with the series Punisher War Journal. Designed to be a companion to the main Punisher series in that War Journal was essentially a sequence of entries regarding Punisher's missions, who he was killing and why, because the concept proved to be so popular, within the pages of the main Punisher comics, Marvel began the process of including War Journal entries explaining his current exploits outside of the events within the War Journal line of comics. That said, in this alternate reality, the mission of the Punisher is to track down and attempt to kill Deadpool, something he spent the last 2 days trying to do. In addition to this, the problem Castle faces is that while he has killed Wade 32 times before, which included burying, burning, dropping him into a river, and even weighing him down with rocks, because of his healing factor and because an unknown individual keeps freeing him, Wade keeps reforming himself where he goes on to taunt Castle in a cat-and-mouse game. Now, where he is finally successful in capturing Wade and cuts him into pieces believing that if he buries them in separate locations, it'll keep Wade from reforming, Maberry takes the opportunity to provide us with a backstory of what had happened, leading to the world ending up the way it did. What we're told is that somewhere along the line, Punisher had killed Daredevil, and while both Matt Murdock and Wade had been a part of whatever laid waste to the planet, neither of them were the catalyst. Traveling back to the first signs that something was wrong, Castle tells us that prior to the collapse of everything, Spider-Man and Rhino had engaged in a fight with one another. Where their battle had stretched several blocks in New York leading to Madison Square Garden and interrupting a Rangers hockey game, instead of standing down once Rhino had been defeated, Spider-Man actually began to eat him. Now, regarding this bit of storytelling, Maberry is actually drawing from 2 elements. The first is the Marvel Zombies event, and the second is the inherent nature of the human community in the Marvel Universe. What I mean here is that with Maberry having contributed to the Marvel Zombies landscape with the Wolverine tie-in, which focused on Logan during the Zombie Civil War, within the comics themselves, because Spider-Man was so popular as a hero, the initial response of humanity was that he was defeating a well-known villain in front of their eyes, something many of them had only ever seen on television. While the Fantastic Four had been called in and were able to subdue Peter, in the days following the incident, as the world's foremost scientist, Reed Richards had been answering a series of questions from all directions as to whether or not it was an isolated incident and if Peter had become a zombie. Now, the influence of the Marvel Zombies series came in that with Peter not really being a zombie, instead, his mind had been altered in a way that resulted in him devolving into an animalistic state. In addition to this, the idea of Spider-Man's actions being an isolated incident were proven false when Frank Dukes, also known as the Blob, had gone into a Chinese restaurant and consumed every human being inside. Following this, and over the course of the next several days, the pattern of cannibalistic behavior among Marvel's heroes and villains continued to sweep across North America, with Daredevil consuming several nuns, as well as humans themselves being affected and attacking other humans. Now again, the final step in Mayberry differentiating this story from the events of Marvel Zombies is that instead of simply consuming flesh, these cannibals were actually waging war on one another, using human remains as decorative pieces, and taking on a culture similar to the primitive Germanic tribes during the days of the Roman Empire. Now for Frank Castle himself, while the internet blacked out after a month in the wake of utilities failing and society collapsing, small groups of heroes and humans emerged in an effort to stave off the cannibals and consolidate the remnants of society. Where most of these groups were short-lived in that Castle, Wolverine, and Rogers had fought together, and Susan Storm had attempted to keep her family protected, when Rogers became infected, Castle had put him down, and Susan Storm had killed Valeria and Franklin once they turned as well. Continuing to fast-track the history of events, Castle tells us that somewhere along the line, Ben Grimm had formed a tribe within the remnants of the Baxter Building, taking Carol Danvers and Polaris as wives, where he also consumed a large majority of people. While Castle was able to destroy him after spending a year amassing enough armament to pull it off, Namor the Submariner had killed those humans taking refuge in ships, and Thor had simply left for Asgard after he was forced to kill the infected warriors of Ares and Hercules. Now where Mayberry had left things largely ambiguous regarding how it was that Punisher had survived so long amidst the cannibalistic heroes with powers, this question is answered when Castle winds back to the events before the start of the infection. What he tells us is that at some point he had come across information regarding the Russian mafia engaging in an arms deal with a Middle Eastern extremist group involving the possibility of a suitcase nuke. While Castle was able to break into the warehouse and interrupt the arms deal, after engaging in a firefight and killing all those involved, he was splashed with a biological weapon of unknown origin. Now the reason for Mayberry including this bit of writing is to point to the inherent flaw of Frank Castle himself. What I mean here is that when Castle discovers the criminal activities of nefarious individuals within Marvel Comics, he does not usually take the time to investigate what's happening and why. Instead, he simply arrives at the scene, and if he witnesses a crime taking place, he kills everyone and walks away. As a result, Castle does not take into account the issue of collateral damage and the idea that his violent acts may have unforeseen consequences. Seeing this to its fruition within the story, after the collapse of society and while investigating the chemicals himself, Castle learned that the biological weapon was an unfinished experiment on how to survive in an environment following global nuclear war or some other kind of unspecified calamity. To this end, the chemical modified the genes of humans, allowing their bodies to adapt to virtually any environment, allowing them to breathe any kind of toxic atmosphere, but also consume virtually any material in order to keep their bodies alive. Now, while Mayberry does not provide a direct answer as to why Castle had not succumbed to cannibalism, he instead offers a theory picked by Hank McCoy, stating that because Frank Castle had been hit with such a heavy dose of the chemical, his body had essentially formed an immunity to all forms of illness and disease without the side effects of cannibalism. Now again, because Castle didn't give any thought to the aftermath of his actions, instead of calling in a hazardous material crew to clean up the mess, instead, he simply left. As a result, the chemical made its way into New York's water supply due to its ability to survive in any environment. To this end, the chemical itself was spread throughout the crops and food sources all along the eastern seaboard, where it was consumed by virtually everyone in the country. While not all individuals became cannibals due to their immunity to the infection, once the scientific community became aware of the fact that the chemical had spread across the country, because it had been developed in a private lab, none of the scientists knew what it was or how to handle it. Now during this time, and because those becoming cannibals were considered isolated incidents, with New York containing JFK International Airport, infected individuals were continuing to travel internationally, not knowing that they were infected, which led to the illness spreading to every corner of the planet. However, once the infection began to hit the mainstream after Peter Parker's incident, because the chemical did not provide any symptoms of its presence beside cannibalistic behavior and primitive actions, the early attacks were attributed to violence related to the economic downturn or violent video games. But as more and more scientists operated under the leadership of Richards in investigating the infection, after tracing the chronology of the attacks to their source, the world's top minds, including Hank Pym, Beast, Adam Brashear, Victor Von Doom, and Reed Richards himself, had all come to the realization that while they had figured out the cause of the infection, because it had been spreading around the world for a year, it was virtually impossible to react in a way that would maintain society as they knew it. And so as the first issue comes to a close, we continue with Frank Castle as he works to track down Spider-Man, who he considers to be Patient Zero, or the first person to be infected with the virus, but also openly admitting and coming to grips with the fact that because of his negligence, he had essentially killed the world. With that being said, we're going to bring this video to an end. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And let me know down in the comments section what you guys think about this story so far, because to be honest, I think it's probably one of the best stories from Punisher in a long time. And I will catch you guys later. Peace.